In April 1813, one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire died in Jamaica. His personal estate was valued at over £1 million, equivalent to more than £82 million today. By the time of his death, Simon Taylor claimed ownership over 2,248 human beings. His fortune was built entirely on sugar and the forced labor of enslaved people. And yet, most people have never heard his name. This is the story of how one man accumulated unimaginable wealth through a system of calculated exploitation, and how his letters reveal the mindset that kept that system running. Simon Taylor was born on December 23, 1739, in Jamaica, the firstborn son of Patrick Tailsor, a Scottish immigrant who had anglicized his surname to Taylor. Patrick had arrived from Forfarshire, Scotland, and married well. His wife, Martha, was the daughter of George Hanbury Taylor, a successful white Jamaican sugar merchant. Through this marriage, Patrick entered Jamaica's commercial elite. Patrick took over his father-in-law's business and prospered as a sugar merchant in Kingston, the colonial capital. In January 1740, just 1 month after Simon's birth, the infant was baptized in an Anglican church. It was a statement of belonging, of membership in the white planter class that controlled Jamaica's economy. When Simon was 12 years old, his father sent him to England for his education. He attended Eton College, one of the most prestigious boys' schools in Britain. It was there, in 1754, that young Simon received devastating news. His father, Patrick, had died. At just 14 years old, Simon Taylor became the inheritor of a substantial fortune. Patrick left him £50,000, making him one of the wealthiest young men in the colony. But Simon wouldn't return to Jamaica immediately. He still had his education to complete, including time spent studying business in Holland. When Simon Taylor finally returned to Jamaica around 1760, he was 20 years old and ready to turn his inheritance into something far greater. He looked at the colonial economy and saw opportunity. The British appetite for sugar was insatiable. The plantations of Jamaica were generating enormous profits for those willing to exploit the system to its fullest extent. Taylor began his transformation from merchant's son to planter. In the early 1760s, he converted his father's 900-acre estate at Lysons in St. Thomas in the East Parish into a sugar plantation. At the same time, he purchased the Lanrumney Sugar Estate in St. Mary Parish. He was building an empire, and that empire required enslaved labor. By 1771, Taylor had purchased another sugar estate in St. Thomas called Holland. This estate contained 430 acres of sugarcane and included 400 enslaved Africans who came with the property. These weren't just land transactions. They were purchases of human beings, treated as equipment necessary for production. But Taylor didn't stop with his own properties. He positioned himself as an attorney, not a lawyer, but a plantation manager for absentee owners who lived in Britain. These wealthy Britons owned Jamaican estates, but had no interest in actually living in the Caribbean. They needed someone on the ground to manage their investments and maximize their returns. Simon Taylor became that man. The position of plantation attorney was crucial to Jamaica's sugar economy. Absentee ownership was common. Wealthy Britons wanted the profits of Caribbean plantations without the discomfort of tropical living. Attorneys like Taylor wielded enormous power, managing every aspect of plantation operations, while the actual owners enjoyed their wealth back in England. Taylor's most significant attorney position was managing Golden Grove Estate, owned by Challoner Arkadekna, a member of Parliament who inherited the property from his father, but had no intention of ever visiting Jamaica. Taylor didn't just manage Golden Grove, he lived there, maintaining one of his many homes on the property. Golden Grove became a proving ground for Taylor's management philosophy, and we know exactly what that philosophy was, because Taylor wrote about it extensively. Between 1765 and 1775, he engaged in rich correspondence with Arsadekne, and these letters survive today. They provide an unfiltered window into the mind of one of Jamaica's most successful slaveholders. Professor Chrysler Petley of the University of Southampton has conducted the most comprehensive analysis of Taylor's correspondence to date. What he found was chilling. Taylor saw enslaved people as units of production, as machinery to be used until they wore out and then replaced. In his own words, Taylor believed that exhausted enslaved workers should simply be replaced, just like broken equipment. At Golden Grove, between 1765 and 1775, this philosophy produced results, at least by the horrific metrics Taylor cared about. Sugar production doubled over that decade. The plantation became more profitable, and Taylor charged Arsadekne substantial fees for his services, adding to his personal wealth. But these profits came at an immeasurable human cost. Research into the enslaved population at Taylor's properties reveals that the majority of field laborers were women, while men were more likely to be assigned what were considered privileged roles: masons, coopers, blacksmiths, carpenters, watchmen. This gendered division of labor meant that women bore the heaviest burden of field work. Taylor's records occasionally reveal glimpses of resistance. Sometimes individuals were described as absconded, or run away, or ill-disposed. These brief notations represent moments when someone, through desperation or careful planning, attempted to escape or resist. They remind us that behind Taylor's sterile accounting were real people fighting for their freedom. The documents also show that many enslaved people were ill or injured as a consequence of hazardous physical labor. The work of sugar cultivation and processing was brutally demanding. It involved clearing land, planting cane, harvesting with machetes, and then the dangerous work of processing raw cane in boiling houses where workers faced burns and other injuries. Taylor rarely mentioned individual enslaved people in his letters. When he did write about them, it was in abstract, general, and starkly dehumanizing ways. They were discussed as commodities, as production factors, as problems to be solved. Professor Petley notes that Taylor's letters reveal not just through what they say, but through what they leave out. The silences speak volumes. By the 1780s, Simon Taylor had become the wealthiest man in Jamaica. His property portfolio was staggering. He owned multiple estates: Lysons, Holland, Lanrumney, and others. He managed additional properties as an attorney, and he had made a crucial decision about where to establish his primary residence. Taylor chose to live at Prospect Pen, a property on the outskirts of Kingston. This wasn't just any property. Today, it serves as Vale Royal, the official residence of the Prime Minister of Jamaica. In Taylor's time, it was his seat of power, strategically located near the colonial capital, but removed enough to maintain his own domain. Taylor's political influence matched his economic power. In 1763, he was elected by the white voters of Kingston as one of their 3 representatives in the Assembly of Jamaica. From October 1784 until his death in 1813, He served as a member of the Jamaican legislature for the parish of St. Thomas in the East. He was also Chief Magistrate of St. Thomas in the East in Morant Bay, and served as custos and head of the militia. These positions established Taylor firmly within the plantocracy, the small group of large plantation owners who controlled most of the wealth and political life in Jamaica. His administrative roles gave him direct influence over colonial policy, and he used that influence consistently to protect and expand the interests of slaveholders. The 1780s brought significant challenges to Jamaica's planters. A series of devastating hurricanes struck the island. In October 1780, the Great Hurricane, one of the deadliest Atlantic hurricanes on record, battered Jamaica with catastrophic force. Another hurricane hit in August 1781. These storms destroyed crops, damaged infrastructure, and disrupted the entire plantation economy. Taylor's letters from this period reveal his response to these crises. He wrote extensively about the hurricane damage, but his concern was purely economic. When he described the loss of life among enslaved people at Golden Grove, his tone was that of a man calculating damage to his property. The shocking human cost appeared in Taylor's letters only as it affected production and profit. The hurricanes coincided with other disruptions. The American Revolutionary War had ended in 1783, cutting off important trade routes. Jamaica had relied on North American imports for provisions to feed enslaved workers. Without easy access to these supplies, Taylor and other planters faced famine conditions. Taylor responded by developing provision grounds where enslaved people were forced to grow their own food, and by investing in guinea grass pastures for livestock. Throughout this period, Taylor's brother John presented a different kind of problem. John Taylor had received a baronetcy in 1778 and married Elizabeth Godden Houghton, an heiress who brought sugar plantations in Hanover Parish to the family holdings. But while Simon carefully managed wealth, John spent it lavishly in Europe. Simon frequently complained about his brother's extravagant lifestyle. In one letter from 1772, Simon wrote to John, "I am pretty confident I never shall marry." He was focused entirely on accumulating wealth, not on family life, at least not the legitimate white family life that society expected. In 1786, Simon finally persuaded John to return to Jamaica to properly manage the Hanover estates. Within a year of arriving, John Taylor died during a visit to Simon's license plantation. The death saddled Simon with both John's title responsibilities and his debts. The elder Simon would spend years complaining about clearing the financial mess his younger brother had left behind. On an evening at Golden Grove Estate, Lady Maria Nugent, wife of Jamaica's lieutenant governor, came to visit Simon Taylor. She later recorded her observations in her diary. She noted that Taylor was an old bachelor who detests the society of women. She seemed determined to win him over socially. But during the visit, something revealed the truth behind Taylor's bachelor status. A young mixed-race girl was brought into the drawing room. Lady Nugent was surprised by Taylor's obvious discomfort. Later, the housekeeper explained, the child was Taylor's own daughter. And, according to the housekeeper, Taylor had a numerous family, some on almost every one of his estates. This was Simon Taylor's hidden life. Despite never marrying a white woman, he had relationships with multiple enslaved women and free women of color across his properties. The power dynamics of these relationships cannot be overstated. These were not relationships between equals. Taylor owned some of these women as property. He held absolute power over their lives. Taylor's longest-lasting relationship was with Grace Dawn, a quadroon woman, the term used for someone with one-quarter African ancestry, who lived with him for more than 30 years. Grace was also a doctress, practicing traditional herbal medicine and hygiene techniques associated with Obeah healing traditions. When Taylor fell ill with fever, Grace nursed him back to health. Grace Dawn was part of a community of successful Jamaican doctresses, including Cuba Cornwallis, Sarah Adams, and Mrs. Grant, who was the mother of Mary Seacole. These women preserved and practiced African healing traditions, maintaining knowledge that colonizers often dismissed but frequently relied upon. Some historians have suggested that their hygiene practices may have influenced Florence Nightingale a century later. But despite his 30-year relationship with Grace Dawn, despite having children with her, Taylor never publicly acknowledged them as his heirs. Jamaican law at the time actually forbade planters from passing significant amounts of property to their mulatto offspring. But the law only went so far. Taylor's attitudes reflected choices as much as legal constraints. Taylor also had relationships with other women. Sarah Blacktree Hunter was a free mulatto woman who lived with Taylor on one of his estates. She had been enslaved, but Taylor had made her free. Together, they had a daughter named Sarah Taylor. There were other children on other estates. Even when Taylor fathered children with enslaved women on his own properties, some of those children remained enslaved. One woman, named Charlotte Taylor, was born on Golden Grove Plantation. She was quadroon, one of Taylor's descendants. In his will, Taylor would make provisions for her, but not to free her completely. Instead, he directed his executors to spend £700 to purchase a Negro or other slave to work in Charlotte's place. She would technically remain enslaved, but have someone else do her labor. This arrangement reveals Taylor's twisted logic. He acknowledged paternity through financial provision, but refused to grant freedom. He would support his mixed-race children financially, while maintaining the system that kept people who looked like them in bondage. In 1804, Grace Dawn died. Taylor's letters indicate he was distraught. After 3 decades together, her death affected him deeply. But even in grief, he never publicly acknowledged their relationship or legitimized their children. When Taylor finally wrote his will, he made some provisions for his mixed-race family members, but these were carefully limited. He left £500 to Sarah Blacktree Hunter, his former enslaved mistress who he had freed. He left £1,000 for their daughter, Sarah Taylor, described as a quadroon. Sarah Taylor's daughter, Sarah Cathcart, would inherit £2,000 when she turned 21. He also left £500 to Grace Harris, the mixed-race niece of Grace Dawn. These amounts, while substantial enough to make these women wealthier than many white subjects in Jamaica, represented a tiny fraction of Taylor's massive fortune. The bulk of his estate would go to his white nephew, Sir Simon Richard Brissett Taylor, the 2nd Baronet. Taylor always considered his brother John's son to be his true heir, because that heir was white. When Sarah Blacktree Hunter died in 1834, 2 decades after Taylor's death, but before full emancipation took effect in Jamaica, she left behind a personal estate of over £1,500. Shockingly, her estate included 14 enslaved people. The formerly enslaved woman who had been Taylor's mistress had herself become a slaveholder. This reveals the complex and tragic nature of Jamaican society. The system of slavery was so deeply embedded that even those who had experienced bondage could become complicit in perpetuating it. It demonstrates that slavery wasn't simply about race, though race was central, but about a broader system of power, property, and exploitation that corrupted everyone it touched. In the late 1780s, a movement that would shake the foundations of Taylor's world began to gather force in Britain. The Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was founded in 1787. Led by activists including Thomas Clarkson, Granville Sharp, and William Wilberforce, abolitionists began organizing a campaign to end British participation in the transatlantic slave trade. The abolitionist movement drew on multiple sources. Evangelical Christianity played a role, with Quakers and other religious groups arguing that slavery was a moral abomination. Enlightenment philosophy contributed ideas about human rights and liberty. And, crucially, testimony from formerly enslaved people and missionaries who had witnessed plantation conditions provided powerful evidence of the system's brutality. For men like Simon Taylor, the rise of abolitionism represented an existential threat. Their entire economic model depended on the continuous importation of enslaved Africans. The death rate among enslaved people in Jamaica was horrifically high, far higher than the birth rate. Without constant new arrivals from Africa, the enslaved population would decline, and with it, the profitability of sugar plantations. Taylor's letters from this period reveal his mounting fury. In May 1788, he wrote to Chaloner Arcidecna, defending Jamaican slavery against the upsurge of abolitionist activity in Britain. His argument was purely economic. Slavery was necessary for sugar production, and sugar production was necessary for British wealth. Any interference with this system, he argued, would damage the empire. He railed against critics who, he claimed, knew nothing about actual plantation management. He insisted that claims of cruelty were exaggerated. He argued that if enslaved people were truly treated as badly as abolitionists claimed, they would have already rebelled and cut all our throats. This was a revealing admission. Taylor understood that his power rested on a knife's edge, maintained only through constant domination and the threat of violence. In 1791, events in the Caribbean gave Taylor's fears concrete form. In the French colony of Saint-Domingue, enslaved people launched the Haitian Revolution. This uprising would eventually lead to the establishment of Haiti as an independent nation, the first successful slave revolt to create a modern nation-state. For slaveholders throughout the Caribbean, Haiti represented their worst nightmare realized. Taylor wrote extensively about the Haitian Revolution. His letters reveal both fear and fury. He worried constantly about the possibility of similar uprisings in Jamaica. He saw any concession to enslaved people, even permission for Christian missionaries to preach to them, as a dangerous opening that could lead to rebellion. The war between Britain and revolutionary France added another layer of anxiety. Jamaica was vulnerable to French attack, and the possibility of French forces inciting slave rebellion was a constant threat in Taylor's mind. His letters from the 1790s and early 1800s are filled with military concerns, reports on coastal defenses, and worries about invasion. Through all of this, Taylor maintained his core beliefs. He opposed Christian missionaries working with enslaved people. One missionary, William James Gardner, later described Taylor as a man of degraded habits, and said, "No planter was ever possessed of more power than this imperious, vulgar man." Gardner's description reveals how some observers saw through Taylor's respectability to the brutality underneath. By the early 1800s, the abolitionist movement in Britain had gained significant momentum. Petitions poured into Parliament. Public opinion was shifting. The economic arguments that had once seemed unassailable were losing force as other forms of commerce and industry offered new paths to national wealth. In June 1805, Taylor received a letter from an old friend. Horatio Nelson, Britain's great naval hero, was in the Caribbean pursuing the French fleet. Nelson and Taylor had met during the American Revolutionary War and had maintained correspondence for 3 decades. In his 1805 letter, Nelson expressed opposition to William Wilberforce and the abolitionists. This letter would later become controversial. After Nelson died at the Battle of Trafalgar in October 1805, a version of his letter to Taylor appeared in William Cobbett's Political Register on February 21, 1807, just 2 days before Parliament voted on the abolition bill. The letter had been doctored to make Nelson appear more strongly pro-slavery than the original suggested. It seems likely that Taylor provided the letter to Cobbett as part of a last-ditch effort to use Nelson's heroic reputation to oppose abolition. But the effort failed. On March 25, 1807, Parliament passed the Act for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. The transatlantic slave trade to British colonies was now illegal. Taylor's reaction was visceral. In his letters, he wrote that he was lost in astonishment and amazement at the frenzy which has seized the British nation. From his perspective, the perspective of a man whose entire fortune depended on slavery, the decision made no sense. He saw it as economic self-destruction, as interference by ignorant do-gooders who understood nothing about colonial realities. The passage of the Abolition Act marked a turning point, though not the end of slavery itself. Planters like Taylor could no longer legally import new enslaved people from Africa, but they could still breed enslaved people, sell them within the Caribbean, and, most importantly, continue to hold existing enslaved people in bondage. Taylor had already been considering alternatives. In the late 1790s, he had thought about emigrating to the United States with his enslaved workers. After the Louisiana Purchase in 1803, he mentioned possibly moving to the banks of the Mississippi River, where slavery remained legal and land was abundant. But he never followed through with these plans. After 1807, Taylor's health began to decline. His letters became less frequent. He largely withdrew from active political life, though he maintained his positions and continued managing his estates. For the remaining 6 years of his life, he would watch anxiously as the world he had built and profited from so enormously faced an uncertain future. By 1813, Simon Taylor was 73 years old and in failing health. He had spent 53 years in Jamaica, transforming his father's inheritance of £50,000 into one of the largest fortunes in the British Empire. But age and illness were catching up with him. Taylor made one last attempt to return to England. He traveled to Port Royal, Jamaica's old naval base, still determined to reach Britain and die surrounded by his white relatives, his nephew, Sir Simon Richard Brissett Taylor, and his nieces. But he was too weak to make the journey. On April 14, 1813, Simon Taylor died at Port Royal. He never made it back to England. His death triggered an extraordinary process. Taylor's body was initially interred at his main residence in Kingston, but shortly afterward, his executors decided to move his remains to his license estate in St. Thomas in the East, where the family had a burial plot. The manner of this transfer caused scandal in Jamaica's colonial society. Taylor's body was moved 60 kilometers on the back of a common mule-drawn cart. Edward Morrison, the lieutenant governor of Jamaica, wrote in a local newspaper that the whole affair was done in not a very decent manner. For a man of Taylor's wealth and status to be transported this way seemed like an insult to his memory. Why the indignity? Perhaps it reflected the practical challenges of moving a body in tropical heat. Perhaps it revealed something about how Taylor was actually viewed by his peers, respected for his power but not necessarily beloved. Or perhaps it simply demonstrated that in death, all the wealth and status in the world couldn't overcome basic logistical problems. But the real accounting came with Taylor's estate valuation. When his will was probated, the numbers were staggering. Taylor's personal estate was valued at over £750,000. Some calculations put his total wealth at over £1 million, equivalent to more than £82 million in today's money. To put this in perspective, only 15 millionaires died in Britain between 1809 and 1859. Simon Taylor was among them. He had amassed a fortune that placed him among the wealthiest individuals in the entire British Empire. His property holdings included at least 12 estates or pens. At the time of his death, these properties held 2,248 enslaved people. That's 2,248 human beings whose labor had generated his fortune, whose lives were considered his property, whose children would be born into bondage on his estates. In St. Thomas in the East alone, he held 1,212 enslaved people. Holland Estate had 610. Lysons had 341. Even at Prospect Pen, his Kingston residence, he kept 70 enslaved workers. The majority of Taylor's estate went to his nephew, Sir Simon Richard Brissett Taylor, the second baronet. This inheritance would transform the young man into one of Britain's wealthiest aristocrats overnight. But there's a bitter postscript to this inheritance. Sir Simon Richard Brissett Taylor died just 2 years later, in 1815. The baronetcy ended with him. The estates then passed to his sister, Anna Susanna Watson Taylor, who had married George Watson in 1810. Watson took the additional name Taylor when the inheritance came through. George Watson. Taylor proceeded to squander much of Simon Taylor's carefully accumulated fortune. He purchased estates in Wiltshire, assembled a large art collection, and lived extravagantly. He became a member of Parliament and numbered King William IV among his friends. But financial management wasn't his strength. The fortune that Simon Taylor had spent a lifetime building was largely dissipated within a generation. There's a certain poetic justice in this. The wealth extracted through 50 years of human exploitation, carefully hoarded and invested, meant little in the end. It couldn't preserve the family line. The baronetcy died out. It couldn't ensure wise stewardship. The inheritors spent it. And it couldn't prevent the eventual end of the system that had generated it. Simon Taylor's letters survived him. Thousands of pages of correspondence, carefully preserved, eventually made their way into archives. In the 20th and 21st centuries, historians began to study these documents intensively. What they found was a detailed record of one man's life at the center of British slavery in the Caribbean. Professor Chrysler Petley of the University of Southampton has conducted the most comprehensive analysis of Taylor's papers. In his book, White Fury, a Jamaican Slaveholder, and the Age of Revolution, Petley uses Taylor's letters to explore not just one man's life, but the entire world of Caribbean slavery during its final decades. What emerges is a portrait of greed, cruelty, fear, and fury. Taylor's letters reveal the mindset of a man who saw human beings as commodities, who calculated the value of children born into slavery, who treated exhausted workers as machinery to be replaced. They show someone who genuinely believed he had a right to own other people, to force them to work until they were worn out, to separate families when it suited his economic interests. But the letters also reveal Taylor's anxieties. He worried constantly about slave rebellions. He feared that any concession, allowing missionaries to preach, improving living conditions, recognizing enslaved people's humanity, would undermine the entire system. His fury at the abolitionist movement stemmed from this fear. He understood, perhaps better than he could admit, that slavery depended on absolute domination. Any acknowledgement of enslaved people's humanity threatened the whole edifice. The letters reveal something else, too: the way slavery corrupted everyone it touched. Taylor's relationships with Grace Dawn and other women of color, his mixed-race children scattered across his estates, his financial provisions for some of them in his will. All of this demonstrates a recognition, however limited and self-serving, of their humanity. Yet he continued to participate in and defend a system that treated people exactly like them, as property. Research has also begun to uncover the other side of the story: the experiences of the 2,248 people Taylor claimed to own. Through careful analysis of estate records, slave lists, and other documents, historians have pieced together glimpses of their lives. The majority of field workers were women. Many people were chronically ill or injured from the brutal labor. Some resisted, running away, feigning illness, working slowly, practicing covert forms of protest. A few achieved specialized roles that offered slightly better conditions. Some were granted small plots to grow their own food, though this privilege really meant they had to work even more to feed themselves and their families. The enslaved community maintained their own social structures, family networks, cultural practices, and forms of resistance that plantation records only occasionally captured. When Taylor's records note someone as absconded or ill-disposed, they are documenting acts of resistance against a system that tried to reduce people to units of production. Golden Grove Estate, where Taylor managed operations for the Arxidecna family and where he fathered children, today exists as a small town in eastern Jamaica. The Golden Grove Sugar Factory operated there until 2019, when it finally closed, the last sugar manufacturing plant in eastern Jamaica. The landscape still bears the marks of centuries of sugar cultivation, though most of the original plantation infrastructure is gone. Prospect Pen, Taylor's Kingston residence, underwent a dramatic transformation. After passing through various hands, it was eventually purchased by the government and renamed Vale Royal. Today, it serves as the official residence of Jamaica's Prime Minister. The building where Simon Taylor lived, where he wrote his letters defending slavery, where he met with other planters to coordinate their political strategies, now houses the leader of an independent Jamaica. There's something fitting about this transformation. The seat of Taylor's power became the seat of power for a nation that emerged from the system he defended. But the legacy of slavery didn't disappear when emancipation came in 1834, or when Jamaica gained independence in 1962. The economic and social structures created by slavery persisted, evolving but never entirely vanishing. The wealth Taylor accumulated didn't stay in Jamaica. Like most absentee plantation owners' profits, it flowed to Britain, where it funded art collections, country estates, and aristocratic lifestyles. This pattern of wealth extraction had lasting effects. Jamaica was left impoverished after emancipation, while Britain reaped the benefits of centuries of enslaved labor. When Britain finally abolished slavery throughout its empire in 1833, the government paid compensation, but not to the formerly enslaved people. Instead, they paid compensation to the slaveholders for their loss of property. The Legacies of British Slavery project at University College London has documented this process, tracking where this compensation money went and how it shaped British society. Simon Taylor's heirs likely benefited from this compensation system. The enslaved people on his former estates received nothing. They gained their freedom, but they faced it without resources, without land, without the accumulated wealth that generations of their labor had created. Simon Taylor's story raises uncomfortable questions that remain relevant today. How do we reckon with enormous wealth built on systematic exploitation? Taylor turned £50,000 into over £1 million through the calculated use of enslaved labor. He wasn't unique. He was simply more successful than most at operating within a system that commodified human beings. His success came from his willingness to embrace that system fully, without the moral qualms that bothered some of his contemporaries. His letters reveal a man who genuinely believed in his right to own other people. He saw abolitionism as irrational, as an emotional movement that ignored economic realities. He couldn't or wouldn't see enslaved people as fully human. When he did acknowledge his own children born to enslaved mothers, it was in the limited, self-serving ways that preserved his status and power. Taylor's relationship with Grace Don for over 30 years, his financial provisions for some of his mixed-race children, his reliance on Grace's medical knowledge when he fell ill, all of this demonstrates that at some level he recognized their humanity. Yet he continued to defend a system that treated people exactly like them as property. This cognitive dissonance was central to how slavery functioned. Slaveholders couldn't completely deny the humanity of enslaved people. They interacted with them daily, depended on their skills and knowledge, sometimes formed relationships with them. But they maintained ideological frameworks that justified treating them as property anyway. The emotional landscape that Professor Petley identifies in Taylor's letters, the anxiety, fear, and fury, reveals how slaveholders understood that their power was precarious. They knew that their domination rested on force, and that any weakening of absolute control threatened the entire system. This is why Taylor reacted with such rage to abolitionism. It wasn't just about economics, though economics mattered. It was about the fundamental challenge to his worldview. What does Simon Taylor's story mean for us today? It's a reminder that historical injustices have long-term consequences. The wealth Taylor accumulated didn't disappear. It flowed into British families, funded estates and education, and created lasting advantages. Meanwhile, the descendants of the 2,248 people he claimed to own started freedom without resources, without compensation for centuries of stolen labor. The story also reminds us how ordinary people can participate in and defend extraordinary evil when it serves their interests. Taylor wasn't a cartoonish villain. He was educated at Eton, cultured enough to correspond with admirals and MPs, successful by every metric his society valued. He was, as his gravestone read, considered a loyal subject, a firm friend, and an honest man by many of his peers. Yet his entire fortune was built on a foundation of human suffering. The sugar that made him rich was produced through a system that worked people until they were, in his own words, worn out like broken machinery. The estates he managed so efficiently were sites of forced labor, family separation, and early death for thousands of people. Understanding figures like Simon Taylor is essential to understanding how slavery functioned. It wasn't maintained primarily by sadists or monsters, though there was plenty of cruelty. It was maintained by people who convinced themselves it was necessary, economical, and justified. By men who did careful accounting of profits and losses while reducing human beings to line items in ledgers. Taylor's thousands of letters, preserved in archives and now available for study, provide an invaluable window into this mindset. They show us how intelligent, capable people can embrace and defend deeply immoral systems. They reveal the mental gymnastics required to maintain such cognitive dissonance, acknowledging relationships with enslaved people while defending their enslavement, claiming to care about their welfare while treating them as replaceable machinery. As Professor Petley notes, there's a danger in telling Taylor's story as he would have wanted it told, as the tale of a self-made man, a victim of abolitionist extremism. The responsible way to engage with his story is to read between the lines, to attend to what he left out as much as what he included, to hear the voices he tried to silence. Those silences speak powerfully. When Taylor's records note that someone had absconded, that clinical word documents an act of courage and desperation. When lists show women doing the heaviest field work, they document systematic exploitation along gender lines. When children born on his estates are recorded with monetary values beside their names, those numbers document the complete objectification of human life. The 2,248 people Simon Taylor claimed to own at the time of his death had names, families, hopes, cultures, and histories that his records only occasionally captured. They resisted in ways both dramatic and subtle. They maintained community and culture under conditions designed to break them. They survived. Today, historians work to recover their stories from the gaps in records like Taylor's. It's painstaking work, because slaveholders like Taylor weren't interested in documenting the full humanity of the people they enslaved. But through careful research combining plantation records, archaeological evidence, oral histories, and comparative analysis, we can begin to understand their experiences. The Golden Grove Sugar Factory operated until 2019, over 250 years of continuous sugar production on land where enslaved people once worked under Simon Taylor's management. When it finally closed, it marked the end of an era that began in the colonial period. The landscape is still shaped by that history. Vale Royal, where Taylor once lived, now houses Jamaica's prime minister. But the transformation of buildings doesn't erase historical legacies. The economic patterns established by plantation slavery, extreme inequality, wealth concentration, dependent economies, persist in modified forms. Understanding that history is essential to addressing its ongoing effects. Simon Taylor died in 1813 as one of the wealthiest men in the British Empire. 21 years later, in 1834, the British Parliament finally abolished slavery throughout the empire. The system Taylor had defended so vigorously that he had claimed was essential to British prosperity came to an end, though full emancipation wouldn't come until 1838, after a period of apprenticeship that prolonged exploitation. Did the British economy collapse as Taylor had predicted? Number. Britain continued to prosper, finding new forms of commerce and exploitation to replace the plantation system. The dire warnings of slaveholders proved false, but the legacy of slavery didn't end with emancipation. The wealth accumulated through slavery, the social hierarchies it created, the racial ideologies it spawned, the economic structures it established, all of these persisted and evolved. They shape our world still. Simon Taylor's story is about one man who built enormous wealth through systematic exploitation. It's about how ordinary people can embrace extraordinary evil when it serves their interests. It's about the human capacity for cognitive dissonance, recognizing humanity while denying it, forming relationships while maintaining domination. Most importantly, it's about the 2,248 people whose names and stories Taylor's records mostly obscured. His fortune was built from their labor, stolen over lifetimes of forced work. His power rested on their subjugation. His anxiety stemmed from his knowledge that they might resist. And his fury at abolitionism reflected his understanding that the system he benefited from was fundamentally unjust. Their resistance, their survival, and their eventual freedom represent the real historical triumph, not Simon Taylor's business acumen or his accumulation of wealth. The fact that Jamaica is now an independent nation, that Vale Royal now houses a Jamaican prime minister rather than a Scottish-descended slaveholder, represents a profound reversal of the order Taylor fought to maintain. But we cannot forget how that order functioned, who benefited from it, and how it continues to shape the world we live in. Simon Taylor's letters survived him, providing an invaluable record of how slavery worked from the perspective of one of its most successful practitioners. They remind us that studying perpetrators is as important as honoring victims. Understanding how good people convince themselves to do evil things, how systems of oppression maintain themselves, how ideology justifies injustice. All of this remains relevant. As Professor Petley wrote, understanding greed, cruelty, fear, and fury in the past can help us recognize and resist those forces in the present. Simon Taylor claimed ownership over 2,248 human beings. He died in 1813, leaving a fortune of over £1 million. His heirs squandered much of that wealth within a generation. The system he defended ended 2 decades after his death. The empire that protected his interests eventually released its Caribbean colonies. But the story of Simon Taylor, and of the thousands of people whose labor created his fortune, continues to matter. It's a story about power, exploitation, resistance, and the long shadow of historical injustice. It's a story we need to understand if we're going to reckon with that legacy and work toward a more just future. The millionaire died. His fortune dispersed. His system collapsed. But the reckoning with what he represented continues,